Hi, so I'm Ollie. I am a PhD student who started this October at the University of Oxford. I'm supervised by Helen Johnson in Oxford and Chris Wilson at the National Oceanography Centre. So I wanted to take a little bit of time today to talk about some work that I've been doing very recently, as in the last month or so, looking specifically at the basically a Lagrangian decomposition of the circulation in the subpolar North Atlantic. So just to kind of set out why why we might want to do this. Firstly, I would say there's been a growing number of studies that are looking to Lagrangian methods and techniques to try and decompose the overturning circulation, partly driven by this increasing number of virtual particle tracking tools that are available now. There's a whole host of things. Today, I'm going to focus just on one called TrackMass, which some people may have come across before. But also there's the second point here, which is the need to sort of go beyond integrated Eulerian metrics and the desire to understand overturning circulation in a far more refined way. And so a lot of the inspiration for this work has come from a wonderful paper by Sotirio Georgiou and co-authors on the direct and indirect pathways through of convected water masses through the Labrador Sea. And so I'm going to talk a little bit later on about how some of the findings from that and some of the methodologies are going to be adapted in this research. And so the main thing I want to talk about is actually looking at exploring some of the pathways responsible for overturning in the stationary velocity fields from a numerical model. So in terms of just providing a bit of an outline for how you go about doing these kind of experiments, so I'm working with an eddy permitting quarter degree ocean model hindcast. So it's forced by the Drakkar reanalysis data set, the fifth reanalysis data set. And from that, I get the 5-day mean output, and I am averaging this to create a selection of stationary hydrographic fields from the period of 1976 to 2005. And so using those fields, then we use those fields to advect particles using TrackMass. So TrackMass uses an analytical scheme. So rather than a numerical scheme like Runge-Kutta, this is using the streamlines of the flow instead. There is a slight difference in the sense in that we don't actually include any parameterization for the sub-grid scale physics. And so this is quite an important point, and I'll come back to it later. It's a bit of a caveat and something that we're working to move beyond. But at the moment, this just includes the effect of the resolved velocity fields in the model. And in terms of what we output, then we look at the particle positions, but we also look at traces that are evaluated along these trajectories. In particular, we look at potential temperature, salinity, and potential density as well. So in terms of how I've set up this experiment, what I'm looking to do is recreate in the model an OSNAP East and OSNAP West like array, and seeding particles. In particular, I want to talk about OSNAP East for this talk, but seeding particles along OSNAP East and West in this simulation where transport is out of the basin. So as you can see, this is a ever so slightly jagged line, and that's because we use a combination of zonal and meridional cell walls to do this. That's just the way in TrackMass works. You have to define one of the cell walls to release particles from. The maximum transport that any particle is allowed to have is 0.01 spherodrop. So we're trying to fill as many particles as we can to try and improve the quality of the statistics that can derive from this. And the red lines that you see are the limits of the domain. So whenever a particle released from either OSNAP East or West circulates in the domain and comes into contact with one of those limits, it's then terminated and withdrawn from the simulation. The maximum lifetime, however, that any particle is allowed to reach is 10 years in the simulation. So we're only looking at around a decade's worth of trajectories. So now I just wanted to take this first bit to look at specifically release from OSNAP East and look at some typical pathways. As I say, this is very recent. I've only had most of this data in the last week or so. So what I've done here is I seeded a total of 10,549 particles, and I've broken it down just into these predominant pathways. So if we look at what goes directly from our model OSNAP East to West, we have around just over 30 spherodrops. And as I've indicated in the bottom left left-hand corner here, we also can see that this is confined to the boundary current on the east of Greenland. In addition to that, we have around 16, just over 16 spherodrops, which is recirculated back through this this array. Majority of this is recirculated when we look into the trajectories in the Erminger current, and then there is a very small amount that's recirculated from the boundary current on the east coast of Greenland. Interestingly, we have this other section of very dense water, which is just to the west of the Rockall Plateau. This is a direct pathway that goes east to south, just under 3.5 spherodrops, which I'm looking at the moment in quite a bit of detail, because this is very much a kind of almost homogeneous path. It's bathymetrically constrained initially and then spreads ever so slightly, but comes out pretty much as I've indicated on this arrow. So I'm going to really focus on this blue pathway, this east to west, for the remainder of the talk. And this is where I kind of utilize some of the techniques that Sotirios Georgiou and co brought into play in their paper on the Labrador Sea. And so looking at the east to west pathway, what I'm doing here is effectively isolating the transport and tracer values on entry into the Labrador Basin. So you can see those marked in blue. And then we also record the transport and tracer values of each particle. Transport is conserved for every particle, I should point that out. So we're really interested in how the tracer of potential density changes as a net result of passing through the Labrador Sea. And so on the right hand side, I'm showing the input density space transport for the pathway, and then overlaid as well is the output. So the two things I wanted to point out is that we do see an increase in density, particularly for the lighter classes. But not only that, but we also see that the peak transport of input actually decreases in density space ever so slightly as well. And this graphic is what I wanted to focus on now in terms of presenting some three-dimensional pathways to look at. So what I've done here is defined three transformation pathways based on the net change in potential density through the Labrador Basin. So firstly, I've defined a light pathway, so in which water is transformed to become lighter as a result of passing through the Labrador Sea, and this accounts for the smallest amount of transport, and also this is exported the quickest of these pathways. So I've presented here the time taken for 90% of the particles in this pathway to exit the Labrador Sea as this figure here, so 330 days. I've also presented a neutral pathway, which accounts for almost the same as the dense water pathway, albeit this is nowhere near as long. So the dense water pathway is the longest in time of them all, and this is consistent with what was found in the Georgiou et al. Paper, that the denser pathways have the longest export times. I should add to this as well that one thing that I haven't done yet, which I definitely want to do, is break down how this density change occurs. Is it through an interior pathway of the Labrador Sea, which is precisely one of the mechanisms that the Georgiou et al. Paper identified, but also to look at how it's driven by either salinity or temperature changes. Very quickly, I'm just going to change. Ooh, can I find it? Hopefully I can. Oops. Just going to share a different screen where I've got another illustration. So what I wanted to do is show you what some representative trajectories look like in three-dimensional space. So this is the model bathymetry of the subpolar North Atlantic. And what I wanted to do is show you, firstly, the dense water pathway in three-dimensional space. Now, I will caveat this by saying, because we only include the resolved model fields, this is one of the main talking points we've had in our recent meetings, because we're only including the resolved vertical velocities of the model, we don't capture some of the important processes in the mix layer. And so this is why we have a need to introduce that parameterization at the surface. But for illustrative purposes, I wanted to just sort of show this, this is an example of a trajectory from the dense pathway. And if I just sort of zoom in and give a bit of an illustration, illustration here of what we see. In this particular case, this is a particle that starts life very, very close in the boundary current off East Greenland. And then on moving and progressing around Greenland and northwards, it then is subducted. So this is why I say we particularly need to take into consideration the role of the vertical velocity field as well. This dense water pathway is ultimately exported to the south at depth. If I now sort of move on to the lighter and neutral pathways, these are pathways which are constrained to the surface. So in this case, the density on entry to the Labrador Sea is greater than that on exit. And this particular pathway is then ultimately continues on and remains in the model domain for the entire 10 years. So it passes all the way down before being re-advected into the North Atlantic current, where it then past Scotland is actually drawn down and becomes denser, as an example of what happens when we have a second circulation around the Labrador Sea. The final pathway is a neutral pathway, which I want to just highlight. This particular pathway its density is predominantly unchanged. It takes a short route through the Labrador Basin before taking we actually identify 3 potential pathways in the North Atlantic current where it warms and becomes more saline before then passing out of the domain to the north. So I just wanted to use this 3-dimensional view just to provide a little bit more of an understanding of these pathways. So I'll finish just by leaving with there we go. Just by leaving with some ideas for future work. So definitely we're wanting to introduce a vertical mixing parameterization in the track mass simulation. But also, I want to use this methodology and extend it to look at waters and look at the transformation north of OSNAP East. And in particular, some early work I've done on this suggests that the water that is coming from the subtropics from 40 north experiences quite significant transformations north of OSNAP East. So that's something I would like to focus on. And then ultimately progressing and comparing this to the time evolving fields and understanding particularly how mesoscale features potentially drive big changes in the circulation, but also examining the variability in these pathways in relation to in particular surface forcing as well. So if anyone, please, if you have any questions or most definitely ideas, I'd love to hear them.
Thank you, Ollie. That was really nice. Any questions for Ollie?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So, Ali, thanks for the great talk. I wanted to clarify when you say that the light pathway takes 330 days on average, is that counted from from Cape Farewell, from the southern tip of Greenland to 53 north, all the way around the Labrador Sea, or is it what are the end points on the
So this is the time taken in the Labrador Basin. So it's from the point of entry and it hits the model-defined OSNAP West to when it leaves. And so what the numbers I gave you is the time for 90% of all the particles in that class to have left. So it's like the 90th percentile of that residence time. So it's not the entire length of that. It's just the time in the Labrador Sea.
Okay, thanks. Thanks a lot.
No way.
Any other questions?
I have a question. That was a really interesting talk. So I'm trying to piece together the Lagrangian results with the traditional Eulerian view of the MOC at OSNAP East and OSNAP West. So how do these numbers compare, or how do we piece them together to understand the entire picture of the overturning?
Yeah, okay. So this is where potentially it becomes a little more challenging. So one of the ideas, or one of the ways in which you could do that, is if we seed on the OSNAP East and West lines both into and out of the basin and track where particles go, then you can use the final locations to then divide what is the Eulerian overturning through where the actual pathways eventually go to. In this particular method, what we're doing is examining the effect of a single pathway. And so really one of the things to do, and I'm definitely going to be looking at, is if you, instead of looking at the east to west pathway, if we look at all of the water that actually passes into the Labrador Sea. So in this case, we'd be seeding particles on OSNAP West, as defined in this case, that is passing into the basin, and then look at what happens to that. Then we get an overall picture rather than individual pathways. So if we combine the two, then we have something which is somewhat comparable to the traditional metrics.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another quick question of the Subpolar pathway you mentioned originating from west of Rockall Trough. Do you know what that dense water is in this model?
No, so that's something that I've really only just been looking at for very briefly. In terms of its breakdown, I actually haven't had a chance to look at, so it will be definitely something to focus on in the future, just to identify what it is, and also when hopefully moving to the time evolving experiments, just to see if it's still we still see a signature like that, or whether this is something that's in the stationary fields, but not necessarily in the time evolving.
Awesome, thank you.